No one in that part of Chicago would have guessed that the thin young man climbing the cracked apartment stairs every night was only days away from walking into a marriage that would change his life forever. Elian Brooks was 23, a college senior with hollow eyes, an exhausted body, and the kind of silence that only belonged to people who had already lost too much too young. By day, he sat in classrooms trying to hold on to the last thread of a future he still wanted to believe in. By night, he worked whatever job would take him, stacking shelves at a convenience store, delivering food through cold streets, tutoring spoiled teenagers whose lives looked nothing like his. He lived alone in a cramped apartment that felt more like a storage box than a home, with stained walls, a narrow bed, and a small table buried under overdue bills. Everything about his life looked temporary, but the debt hanging over his name felt permanent. That debt was not even truly his. It was the shadow of his father, a man who had once moved through Chicago's real estate circles like a rising star and then crashed with enough force to bury everyone close to him. Before the scandal, there had been money, confidence, expensive suits, and promises about a better future. Then came the fraud accusations, the investors who lost everything, the lawsuits, the shame, and the public ruin. The family name became poison. His father died with disgrace tied to him, and his mother did not survive the collapse for long. Grief and pressure hollowed her out until Elian was left alone with unpaid tuition, a ruined family name, and a mountain of liabilities that should have belonged to a dead man but somehow kept hunting the son who remained. He had learned to survive 1 week at a time, but surviving was not the same as living. Every month brought another bill, another threat, another reminder that the past was still chewing through his future. What made it worse was that Elian was not weak. He did not give up easily. That was what turned his life into something even crueler. He kept fighting when most people would have collapsed. He studied during subway rides, memorized notes during lunch breaks, forced himself awake after midnight shifts, and counted every dollar with the precision of someone trying to delay drowning. Yet all that effort never seemed to move him forward. It only kept disaster one step away. Little by little, the feeling began to settle into his bones that no matter how hard he worked, the world had already made its decision about him. He was the son of a disgraced man. He was damaged goods. He was the one left behind to absorb a punishment he had never chosen. Then, on a rainy evening that seemed no different from any other, the call came. Elian had just dragged himself back to his apartment after a delivery shift. His sneakers were wet, his jacket smelled like street rain and fryer oil, and his phone battery was nearly dead. The room was dim except for the weak yellow light above the sink. He was too tired to think, too numb to even feel sorry for himself. Then his phone vibrated in his hand. An unknown number lit up the cracked screen. Normally, he would have ignored it. Unknown calls almost always meant trouble, and trouble never forgot his name. But something in the timing unsettled him. He stared at the number for a moment, hesitated, then answered. What he heard was not the voice of a debt collector, not the sharp tone of a bank, not another cold warning from the wreckage of his father's life. It was the steady, composed voice of an older woman, elegant even through the speaker, a voice that sounded too calm to be harmless. She introduced herself as Margaret Hale. The name meant nothing to him at first. Then came the reason for the call. She wanted to speak with him about his father. That single detail sent a chill through him far sharper than the rain outside. People did not bring up his father unless they wanted something, and nothing good had ever followed those conversations. Elian stood frozen in the middle of the apartment, one hand still gripping the phone, his entire body suddenly alert. The woman did not explain much. She simply said they needed to meet in person. There was an urgency beneath her calm, something measured and deliberate, as if she had rehearsed this moment long before he ever heard her voice. She gave him the address of an upscale cafe downtown, a place so far removed from his daily life it sounded almost unreal. Then the call ended. Just like that, The room felt smaller. Elian remained standing in silence, staring at the dead screen in his hand, his pulse thudding harder with every passing second. He tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who was Margaret Hale? How did she know about his father? Why now, after all these years? He wanted to dismiss it as a trap, a scam, another ugly trick from the graveyard of his family's past. But something deeper held him in place. It was not trust. It was not hope. It was that dangerous thing that appears when a person has been crushed long enough, curiosity mixed with desperation. If someone from his father's past had finally reached for him, then maybe the past was not done with him yet. Maybe it was about to swallow him whole. Or maybe, in some twisted way, it was about to offer him the only opening he had left. That night, sleep never came. Elian lay on his bed staring at the cracked ceiling while the city murmured outside his window. Every memory he had tried to bury began rising again. His father's confident smile before everything fell apart. The whispers. The shame. His mother's tired face in her final months. The unopened letters. The creditors. The suffocating knowledge that he had spent years paying for sins he had never committed. By dawn, his mind was exhausted, but his decision was made. He would go. Not because he trusted the woman. Not because he believed anything good waited for him. He would go because fear had already taken enough from him, and because whatever this was, he could no longer afford to live blind inside a life built on unanswered questions. The next day, Elian did the best he could to make himself look presentable. He put on the least worn shirt he owned, pressed it flat with his hands, and stood in front of the mirror long enough to realize there was no hiding how tired he looked. The face staring back at him was too old for 23. The train ride downtown felt like crossing into another country. The neighborhoods changed, the sidewalks became cleaner, the buildings taller, the people sharper, richer, untouched by the kind of survival that had shaped him. By the time he stood in front of the cafe Margaret had named, he almost turned around. The place was polished glass, quiet wealth, and effortless luxury. It was the sort of place where the air itself seemed expensive. Elian looked down at his shoes and felt, for a moment, like an intruder walking into someone else's life. But he forced himself through the door. Soft music floated through the room. Waiters moved without noise. Cups gleamed beneath warm light. No one there looked like they had ever counted coins before buying dinner. A hostess led him toward a back table, and with every step, the sense that he was walking into something irreversible grew heavier. Then he saw her. Margaret Hale sat alone near the window, dressed with understated elegance, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her posture calm and unshaken. She looked like a woman who had spent a lifetime mastering control. Age had not diminished her presence. If anything, it had sharpened it. She did not rise in surprise when he approached. She watched him with the composed certainty of someone who had known exactly how this meeting would unfold. There was no warmth in her expression, but there was also no cheap cruelty. What unsettled him most was not hostility. It was the depth behind her eyes, the kind that suggested years of pain turned into discipline. Elian sat across from her and felt immediately that he had entered a game whose rules he did not understand. Margaret studied him quietly, as though comparing the son to the father and finding both resemblance and difference. Elian felt a pressure in that silence stronger than any accusation. It was clear this woman had not called him on impulse. Whatever she wanted had been considered, weighed, and carried for a long time. When she finally began to explain why she had reached out, the ground beneath his life started to shift. She knew who his father had been. More than that, she knew exactly what he had done. Her family, she revealed, had been among those destroyed by his father's fraudulent dealings years earlier. The damage had not been minor. It had gutted lives, stripped away security, and left wounds that had never healed. Elian listened with a tightening chest, hearing once again the story he had lived beside but never fully possessed. The shame he had spent years dragging behind him became real in a new way as it sat across from him wearing pearls and calm restraint. Margaret was not speaking from rumor. She was speaking from ruin. That should have been enough to end the meeting. A woman like that did not summon the son of the man who destroyed her life for a polite conversation. Everything in Elian warned him that something darker was coming. He braced himself for threats, humiliation, maybe some legal pressure he had never seen approaching. But Margaret's next move was stranger than anything he could have imagined. She gave him an offer. Not a request. Not a bargain dressed in kindness. An offer so unbelievable that for a moment Elian thought he had misunderstood. She was prepared to eliminate the crushing debts tied to his family name. She could settle what remained, remove the immediate threat hanging over his future, and place him in a position where he would never again have to crawl through life from paycheck to paycheck. In return, she wanted one thing from him. Marriage. The word did not land all at once. It hit like something absurd, then impossible, then terrifyingly real. Elian stared at her, convinced there had to be some mistake. Margaret remained perfectly composed, as if she had expected disbelief and had no interest in softening the blow. She was old enough to be his grandmother. She was wealthy, controlled, and obviously carrying scars that had nothing to do with affection. This was not romance. It was not companionship. It was not even desperation in the ordinary sense. It was a proposal shaped like a contract and sharpened by history. Everything inside him recoiled. And yet the cruel genius of the offer revealed itself almost immediately. Because however twisted it was, Margaret had placed it exactly where his life was weakest. She had found the spot where desperation could overpower pride. She had put a price on escape, and the price was so shocking that it forced him to confront the ugliest truth of all. He had no real power to reject it lightly. Debt had stripped him of the luxury of outrage. Poverty had made even madness worth considering. He sat there in expensive silence, hearing the pulse in his ears, feeling the whole weight of his broken future lean toward that one terrible possibility. For the first time in years, Elian saw a door opening in front of him. But it did not look like salvation. It looked like danger dressed in silk, waiting for him to decide how much of himself he was willing to sacrifice just to stop drowning. Elian did not leave that cafe as the same person who had walked in. The city outside moved as usual. Cars sliding through wet streets, people rushing past under umbrellas. But for him, everything felt distorted, as if the world had quietly shifted its shape while no one else noticed. Margaret Hale's proposal echoed in his mind with relentless clarity, not fading like a strange conversation, but tightening like a trap slowly closing around his thoughts. Marriage in exchange for freedom. A future bought at the cost of something he could not yet fully define. He walked for hours without direction, letting the cold wind cut through his jacket, hoping the discomfort would sharpen his thinking. It did not. Every path his mind tried to take led back to the same unbearable truth. He was out of options. For years, he had fought to survive on his own terms, telling himself that hard work would eventually give him control over his life. But that belief had been wearing thin, and now it cracked under the weight of reality. No matter how much he struggled, the debt never loosened its grip. No matter how hard he pushed forward, the past kept dragging him back. And now, for the first time, someone had offered to erase it all. But not for free. That night, he returned to his apartment and sat in the dark without turning on the lights. The silence felt heavier than usual, pressing against him as if demanding a decision. He replayed every detail of Margaret's presence, the way she spoke without hesitation, the calm certainty in her eyes, the absence of emotion when she mentioned his father. She had not looked like a woman making a desperate or irrational choice. She had looked like someone executing a plan. That realization unsettled him the most. Because if this was a plan, then he was not the one in control. He tried to imagine what his life would look like if he accepted. The debts gone. The constant fear lifted. No more late-night shifts just to survive. No more calculating every dollar before spending it. He could finish his degree without the pressure suffocating him. He could finally breathe. But the image never felt clean. It always carried something darker beneath it, a sense of being owned, of stepping into a life that did not belong to him, of becoming part of something he did not understand. And then came the question he could not avoid. What if this was his only way out? Morning arrived without rest. Elian's body moved through the routine of the day, but his mind stayed locked in that cafe, sitting across from Margaret Hale. Classes blurred together. Words from professors meant nothing. Even his job felt distant, like he was watching someone else perform the motions of his life. Every second he delayed the decision felt like time slipping through his fingers, and the pressure built until it became unbearable. By evening, he stopped pretending he could ignore it. He stood outside his apartment, staring at his phone, knowing that whatever he chose next would define everything that came after. There was no safe answer. Rejecting Margaret meant returning to a future already collapsing under debt. Accepting meant stepping into something unknown, possibly dangerous, with no guarantee of what it would cost him beyond the obvious. His hand tightened around the phone. And then he made the call. The moment he committed, something inside him shifted. Not relief, not hope, but a strange, quiet acceptance, as if he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Margaret's response was immediate, precise, and unsurprised. She had known this was how it would end. The process began almost instantly, as if everything had already been prepared long before he said yes. Within days, Elian found himself moving through events that felt unreal. Documents appeared, arrangements were made, and the structure of his old life began to dissolve with alarming speed. The wedding itself was nothing like the ceremonies he had imagined growing up. There was no celebration, no warmth, no sense of union. It was efficient, controlled, almost clinical. A small gathering, a few witnesses, quiet exchanges, and then it was done. No grand declarations, no lingering emotions. Just a binding agreement sealed under the appearance of marriage. People noticed, of course. Even in a city as large as Chicago, something this unusual did not go unnoticed. A young man marrying a wealthy older woman raised questions, whispers, assumptions that spread faster than truth. Some saw it as greed. Others as desperation. Some guessed it was about money, others about power. But none of them knew the full weight behind it. None of them understood that this was not a choice made lightly, but one forced by circumstances that had been tightening for years. Elian barely registered any of it. His focus was locked on the reality he had stepped into. The moment the ceremony ended, the transition was immediate. He was no longer the struggling student barely holding his life together. He was now the husband of Margaret Hale, a woman whose world operated on a completely different level than anything he had ever known. That difference became undeniable the moment he arrived at her estate. The gates alone made it clear he had crossed into another reality. Beyond them stretched a property so vast it felt disconnected from the city surrounding it. The mansion stood with quiet authority, elegant and imposing, its design reflecting a level of wealth that did not need to prove itself loudly. Everything was pristine, controlled, deliberate. And yet, something about it felt wrong. The silence. It was not peaceful silence. It was the kind that carried absence, as if the house had been built to contain life but had forgotten how to hold it. Even the staff moved with a strange restraint, efficient but distant, as though they were part of the structure rather than people living within it. There were no casual conversations, no warmth, no sense of comfort. Only order. Margaret led him inside without hesitation, her presence commanding the space effortlessly. She did not linger on explanations. She did not offer reassurance. Instead, she established the boundaries of his new life with clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. There were rules. Simple, direct, and absolute. He was to follow her instructions without question. He was not to interfere in certain aspects of the household. And most importantly, there were parts of her life, of this house, that he was not to investigate. The message was clear. This marriage came with conditions beyond what had been spoken in the café. Elian accepted them without argument, but the unease settled deeper inside him. What had seemed like a desperate opportunity now began to reveal itself as something more controlled, more calculated. He was no longer just escaping his past. He had entered a system designed by someone else, with intentions he could not yet see. Days passed, and the distance between them became more apparent. Margaret maintained her composure at all times, speaking only when necessary, interacting with him in ways that felt functional rather than personal. Meals were shared in silence. Questions were answered with precision but without openness. There was no hostility, but there was also no connection. It was not a marriage in any traditional sense. It was an arrangement. And the longer Elian remained in that house, the more he felt like he was living inside something carefully constructed, something that had been waiting for him long before he ever stepped through those doors. At first, he told himself it was just unfamiliarity. But then small details began to stand out. The way certain rooms remained closed. The way staff avoided eye contact when he asked simple questions. The way Margaret's calm occasionally shifted into something colder when certain topics came too close to the past. It was subtle, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore once noticed. And beneath it all, a single thought began to grow. He had escaped his old life. But he had not escaped danger. He had stepped directly into it. The mansion did not feel like a home. It felt like a system, and Elian slowly realized he was not living in it, but being placed inside it. Days blurred together with an unsettling rhythm that never changed. Everything functioned perfectly, yet nothing felt alive. Meals appeared on time, rooms remained immaculate, schedules unfolded with quiet precision, but beneath that perfection was something hollow, something controlled to the point of suffocation. At first, Elian tried to convince himself that this was simply how wealthy people lived, distant, structured, emotionally reserved. But the longer he stayed, the more that explanation began to crack. This was not just discipline. It was isolation, carefully maintained and enforced without ever being openly declared. Margaret remained at the center of it all, calm and unreadable. She moved through the house like someone who owned not just the property, but every silence within it. She spoke to him only when necessary, her tone always measured, never rising, never softening. There was no anger, no kindness, only control. It was as if she had removed everything unnecessary from her behavior, leaving behind only what served her purpose. Elian tried, at first, to reach some form of normality. He asked simple questions, made small attempts at conversation, tried to understand the structure of the life he had entered. But each attempt dissolved before it could take shape. Responses were short, precise, and ended conversations before they began. It was not rejection in the usual sense. It was something colder, the quiet refusal to let anything develop beyond what had already been decided. That was when the unease truly began to settle in. Because this was not a relationship growing distant. It was one that had never been meant to grow at all. He started noticing the house more carefully after that. Not just its size or its luxury, but its patterns. Certain hallways were rarely used. Some doors were always locked. Entire sections of the mansion seemed untouched, as if they existed only to complete the illusion of space rather than to be lived in. The staff moved with strict efficiency, but there was something unnatural in the way they avoided unnecessary presence. They were always there when needed, yet somehow never visible long enough to feel human. And then there was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that allows rest, but the kind that listens. At night, it became impossible to ignore. The vastness of the mansion amplified every small sound, the distant creak of wood, the faint hum of unseen systems, the echo of footsteps that sometimes felt like they did not belong to him. Elian found himself lying awake more often, staring into darkness that felt too deep for a place so meticulously maintained. He told himself he was imagining things. Until the patterns stopped feeling like imagination. One evening, while moving through the house after dinner, he noticed something that had not been there before. A door at the end of a corridor, slightly ajar. It was subtle, easy to overlook, but something about it felt wrong. Not because it was open, but because it usually wasn't. He paused. The rule Margaret had given him echoed immediately in his mind. There were parts of the house he was not to investigate. He had agreed to that without question. At the time, it had felt like a condition attached to a strange arrangement. Now, it felt like a warning he had not fully understood. He stood there longer than he should have, staring at the narrow opening, feeling a quiet pull toward it. Curiosity mixed with something sharper, instinct. The sense that whatever existed behind that door was not just part of the house, but part of the truth he had stepped into without realizing it. He did not open it. But from that moment on, everything changed. Because once he noticed one inconsistency, others began to surface. Margaret's schedule became more noticeable. She disappeared for long periods without explanation, retreating into areas of the house he could not access. When she returned, there was sometimes a subtle shift in her demeanor. Nothing obvious, but enough to suggest something had happened beyond his view. The staff grew more cautious around him. Not openly fearful, but careful. As if they were aware of something he was not supposed to understand. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Answers became even shorter. Eye contact became rarer. And then came the documents. It started innocently enough. A stack of papers left on a desk in a study he had been allowed to use. At first glance, they looked like standard financial documents. Contracts, statements, legal forms. The kind of paperwork that surrounded wealth. But as he looked closer, something felt off. His name appeared. Not once. Multiple times. At first, he assumed it was related to the agreement Margaret had made, the clearing of his debts, the restructuring of his financial situation. That would make sense. That was part of the deal. But the deeper he looked, the less sense it made. There were numbers he did not recognize. Agreements he did not remember signing. Details that went far beyond anything discussed. A slow, cold realization began to form. He had signed documents before. On the day everything began. Documents he had not fully understood. The memory hit him with sudden clarity. The stack of papers Margaret had presented, the urgency, the pressure, the way everything had moved too quickly for careful reading. At the time, he had trusted the outcome more than the process. He had believed the promise of freedom was enough. Now, that trust felt dangerously misplaced. His pulse quickened as he flipped through the pages again, searching for confirmation, for something that would prove he was overreacting. But the more he read, the worse it became. The structure of the agreements suggested something far more complex than simple debt resolution. It suggested transfer, ownership, responsibility that extended beyond what he had imagined. He was no longer just clearing his past. He was being tied to something new. Something far larger. That night, the mansion felt different. Not just silent, but watching. Elian sat alone in the dim light of the study, the documents spread out before him, his thoughts racing faster than he could organize them. Every instinct told him that he had missed something critical, something hidden beneath the surface of everything Margaret had presented to him. And for the first time since accepting her offer, fear replaced uncertainty. Because this was no longer about a strange marriage. It was about control. And the terrifying possibility that he had already given it away. The moment doubt took root, it refused to stay quiet. What Elian had once tried to ignore now began to press against him from every corner of the mansion. The documents he had found did not leave his mind, not even for a second. Their weight followed him through every hallway, every silent meal, every restless night. The more he thought about them, the clearer one truth became: whatever agreement he had entered into was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Margaret, however, remained unchanged. If she noticed the shift in him, she did not show it. Her composure stayed intact, her movements precise, her presence controlled as always. That calmness which had once felt distant, now felt deliberate, like a shield protecting something beneath it. Elian began to watch her more closely, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of necessity.
Every detail mattered now.
Every absence, every pattern, every silence carried meaning. And then, one night, the truth began to crack open. It happened without warning. Elian had woken up in the middle of the night, the kind of sudden awakening that comes without reason but leaves the body tense. The house was completely still, wrapped in that same unnatural quiet he had grown to fear. But something was different. A faint sound, distant but distinct, moved through the silence. A voice. Low, controlled, and sharp enough to cut through the stillness. He stepped out into the hallway, moving carefully, guided by instinct more than thought. The sound led him toward a part of the mansion he rarely approached, a section that always seemed just out of reach, both physically and mentally. The closer he got, the clearer it became. Margaret was speaking on the phone. He stopped before reaching the door. He did not intend to listen. But once he heard his father's name, everything else disappeared. What followed was not a conversation, it was a revelation. The calm tone he had come to associate with Margaret shifted into something colder, more focused, stripped of any pretense. She spoke of plans, of timing, of things finally falling into place. And then came the words that froze him completely. He was never the solution. He was the instrument. Every part of his body went still as the meaning settled in. The marriage, the debts, the sudden intervention in his life. None of it had been about helping him. It had been about completing something that had started long before he ever received that phone call. His father's past had not just created enemies. It had created people who had been waiting. And Margaret had been one of them. But not in the way he expected. She had not been driven by blind revenge. She had been executing something far more calculated. The realization hit him with brutal clarity. The debts that had been cleared were not gone. They had been moved, reshaped, redirected, and tied to him in ways he did not yet fully understand. The documents he had signed were not just agreements. They were mechanisms. Legal structures designed to bind him into a position he could not easily escape. He was not free. He had been repositioned. The sound of Margaret's voice continued, sharp and precise, mentioning details about his father, about damage that needed to be corrected, about consequences that had not yet been fully delivered. There was no hesitation in her tone, no emotional instability, only intention. That was what terrified him most. This had never been impulsive. This had been planned. Elian stepped back slowly, his breathing controlled but shallow, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in around him, the silence now heavy with meaning. Everything he had sensed before, the distance, the rules, the restrictions, suddenly aligned into something coherent. He was inside a design. And he had walked into it willingly. The next morning, Margaret was gone. No explanation. No warning. Just absence. The staff behaved as if nothing had changed, continuing their routines with the same quiet efficiency, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer just controlled, it was tense. Elian searched the house, moving through rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar, looking for any sign of her presence. There was none. Only a single message left behind. Short.
Final.
Cold. It instructed him not to look for her. That alone would have been enough to unsettle him. But it was not the only thing she left. On the main table in the living room, there was an envelope. Thick. Heavy. Waiting. Elian approached it slowly, every step weighed down by the instinct that whatever was inside would confirm his worst fears. His hand hesitated for only a moment before opening it. The contents shattered whatever remained of his certainty. Documents. Contracts. Financial statements. All bearing his name. But these were not the same as before. These were worse. Far worse. The numbers alone were enough to make his chest tighten. Amounts so large they barely felt real, debts that stretched beyond anything he had ever imagined, obligations tied to agreements he did not remember making. The structure of it all was intricate, layered, impossible to dismiss as error. It was deliberate, carefully constructed, and legally binding. His signature appeared again and again across the pages, each time locking him deeper into something he could not undo. The realization hit with crushing force. He had signed more than he thought. Much more. What he had believed to be a path out of debt had become something else entirely. A transfer of liability on a scale he could not comprehend. The weight that had once belonged to his father had not disappeared. It had evolved. And now it belonged to him again. But multiplied. The room seemed to tilt as the full scope of it settled in. Elian dropped into a chair, the papers slipping through his hands, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding in front of him. Every choice he had made, every step he had taken, had led him here. Trapped. Not by force, but by agreement. Then the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Elian stared at it for a second too long before answering, already knowing that whatever came next would not offer relief. The voice on the other end was cold, professional, and completely indifferent. It identified him by name, referenced the debts, acknowledged partial payments that had already been made, and then delivered the part that left no room for misunderstanding. The remaining balance was now his responsibility. Immediate action was expected. There would be consequences. Legal ones. Irreversible ones. The call ended without hesitation. And just like that, the last illusion shattered. Elian was alone in a mansion that no longer felt like an opportunity. It felt like the center of a trap that had already closed. The silence returned, heavier than ever, pressing against him from all sides. The documents lay scattered across the table, each one a piece of a reality he could no longer deny. He had tried to escape his father's past. Instead, he had been pulled deeper into it. And now, for the first time, the question was no longer how to survive. It was whether survival was even still possible. Desperation did not break Elian, it sharpened him. For the first time since everything began, fear stopped paralyzing him and started pushing him forward. Sitting in that silent mansion, surrounded by documents that had already sealed his fate, he understood one thing with absolute clarity: if he stayed still, he would be crushed. The system that had trapped him was too precise, too deliberate. It would not collapse on its own. If there was a way out, he would have to tear it open himself. He began with the only place left, the past. His father's name had always been a shadow, something he avoided looking at too closely because it only brought pain. But now that shadow had taken form, and the only way to understand the trap around him was to step directly into it. Elian started digging into records, reaching out to people who had once been connected to his father, following fragments of information that had been buried under years of silence. What he found was worse than he expected. The scandal had never been just a collapse. It had been a chain reaction. Investors ruined. Families destroyed. Entire lives erased by decisions made behind closed doors. His father had not simply failed. He had taken others down with him, leaving damage that had never truly been repaired. And among those affected, one name kept appearing again and again. Margaret Hale. Her family had not just suffered losses, they had been dismantled. Assets gone, business destroyed, reputations erased. The kind of damage that did not end when the money disappeared, but continued through every year that followed. Elian began to understand the depth of her resentment, the reason her calm had felt so controlled. It was not emptiness. It was containment. But even that did not explain everything. Because what Elian was living through now was not simple revenge. It was too structured, too calculated, too layered. Margaret had been part of it, but she was not the one who had built it. That realization led him further. And eventually, it led him to a name he had not expected. Victor Brooks. His uncle. A man who had been absent for most of his life, rarely mentioned, almost erased from family memory. At first, Elian thought it was coincidence. But the deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. Victor had been there in the background of everything, connected to old business dealings, tied to conflicts that had never been resolved, present in places where the collapse had begun. And most importantly, still active. The moment that connection formed, everything shifted. Because now the trap had a shape. And it had a face. Elian did not hesitate. He tracked Victor down to a quiet suburban house far from the city center, a place that looked ordinary enough to hide the kind of man who preferred to operate unseen. When Elian arrived, there was no surprise waiting for him. No confusion. No denial. Only recognition. Victor had been expecting him. The encounter confirmed everything Elian had begun to suspect. The resentment, the jealousy, the long-standing bitterness toward his own brother had never disappeared, it had evolved. While Elian's father had built his empire and destroyed it, Victor had remained in the background, watching, waiting, carrying his own version of grievance. And when the collapse came, Victor had not been destroyed. He had adapted. What Elian had mistaken for a random act of revenge was, in reality, something far more deliberate. Victor had seen opportunity in the ruins. He had found Margaret, understood her anger, and slowly shaped it into something useful. He had fed her the pieces she needed, guided her toward Elian, and constructed a plan that would not just punish the past, but extend it. Elian was never the target. He was the continuation. A way to transfer consequences from one generation to the next, wrapped in legal structures that made it irreversible. By the time Elian left that house, there was no longer any doubt. He had been used. Margaret had been used. And the man behind it all had been standing just close enough to watch everything unfold. But something else had changed. Elian was no longer reacting. He was thinking. Because if Victor had built the trap, then the trap could be broken. The key was Margaret. Elian knew that whatever role she had played, she had not created the entire system. Her anger had been real, but it had been directed, controlled, shaped into something that served a larger purpose. If she understood the truth, if she saw how she had been manipulated, then the structure could collapse from the inside. Finding her was not easy. She had disappeared with intention, retreating to a place far removed from the city, hidden behind layers of privacy that made it clear she did not want to be found. But Elian did not stop. He followed every lead, pushed through every obstacle, until finally he reached her. A quiet retreat, isolated, distant from everything. The kind of place people go when they want to think, or escape. When Margaret saw him, there was a moment where her composure faltered. It was brief, almost invisible, but it was there. The controlled exterior shifted just enough to reveal something beneath it. Uncertainty. Elian did not waste time. Everything he had uncovered, everything he had pieced together, he laid it out with precision. The connections.
The Manipulation.
The role Victor had played in shaping her actions, in directing her anger toward a target that served his purpose more than hers. At first, Margaret resisted. Not openly, but internally. Years of pain do not dissolve easily. The need for justice, for balance, for some form of resolution had been driving her for too long. Accepting that she had been used, that her carefully executed plan had been part of someone else's design, was not something she could absorb instantly. But the truth has a way of forcing itself through. And Elian did not stop. He stripped everything down to its core. He was not defending his father. He was not denying the damage that had been done. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was exposing control. The turning point came quietly. Not with anger. Not with dramatic realization. But with stillness. The kind that comes when someone finally sees something they can no longer deny. Margaret's silence changed. It was no longer controlled, it was reflective. The pieces aligned in her mind, the inconsistencies she had ignored began to surface, and the realization took hold. The revenge she believed she had been carrying out had not been entirely hers. It had been guided, adjusted, expanded. She had not been ending a cycle. She had been extending it. And Elian had been the final piece. When she finally accepted it, something in her shifted. Not weakness. Clarity. The weight of years did not disappear, but it changed direction. The anger that had once been focused outward now turned inward, not in self-destruction, but in understanding. She had been wrong, not in her pain, but in how it had been used. And that realization was enough. Because once she saw the truth, the purpose of everything changed. The plan was no longer about revenge. It was about exposure. Elian and Margaret, once bound by a twisted agreement, now stood on the same side of something far more dangerous. Together, they began dismantling what Victor had built. Every document, every forged connection, every manipulated contract became evidence. Margaret's resources, once used to execute the plan, were now used to destroy it. The process was not immediate, but it was unstoppable. Piece by piece, the structure collapsed. And at the center of it all, Victor Brooks finally lost control. When the truth surfaced publicly, it was undeniable. Fraud.
Manipulation.
Forgery. The very tools he had used to trap others became the evidence that brought him down. The system he had constructed to remain hidden now exposed him completely. And when he fell, he did not take Elian with him. For the first time since everything began, the weight lifted. Not all at once. But enough. The debts tied to Elian unraveled under scrutiny, the agreements invalidated, the legal bindings broken. What had once felt like an inescapable prison began to dissolve into something else. Something fragile but real. Freedom. But it came with a cost. Because by the time everything ended, nothing about Elian's life remained untouched. And standing beside him was the one person who had started it all. No longer his captor. No longer his enemy. But someone just as changed as he was. And together, they faced what came next, knowing that the hardest part was not escaping the past. It was deciding what to do after surviving it. When everything finally settled, the silence that remained was no longer suffocating, it was unfamiliar. For the first time in years, Elian woke up without the weight of something chasing him. No collectors. No deadlines tied to debts that were never truly his. No invisible system tightening around his life. The collapse of Victor's plan had not only exposed the truth, it had dismantled the structure that held Elian in place. The contracts were voided, the fabricated obligations erased, and the name he had carried like a burden for so long was no longer tied to a trap waiting to close. But freedom did not feel like victory. It felt like standing in open space after years of confinement, unsure of where to step next. Because everything that had defined his life, struggle, survival, pressure, was suddenly gone. And what replaced it was not immediate clarity, but emptiness. The kind that forces a person to confront something deeper than fear. Choice. For so long, Elian had lived reacting to circumstances he could not control. Every decision had been shaped by necessity. Now, for the first time, his path was not dictated by survival. And that was more unsettling than anything he had faced before. Margaret understood that better than anyone. She had also been released from something that had defined her for years. The anger, the need for retribution, the carefully constructed plan that had consumed her life, all of it had collapsed alongside Victor's downfall. What remained was not the person who had orchestrated Elian's entrapment, but someone stripped of the purpose she had carried for so long. And yet, she did not fall apart. She changed. The cold precision that once defined her began to soften, not into weakness, but into something more human. The control remained, but it no longer served vengeance. It became direction. Where there had once been a singular focus on the past, there was now space for something else. Something forward. Elian returned to the mansion one last time, not as someone trapped inside it, but as someone choosing to face it. The building no longer felt like a prison, but it did not feel like a home either. It was something in between. A place that held everything that had happened, every decision, every mistake, every turning point. Margaret received him without distance this time. There was no need for it anymore. What passed between them was not reconciliation in the traditional sense. It was recognition. They both understood what had been done, what had been lost, and what had been learned. There was no attempt to erase the past. No effort to pretend it had been anything other than what it was. But there was something else.
Understanding.
Elian no longer saw her as the architect of his suffering. And Margaret no longer saw him as a continuation of someone else's sins. The roles they had once been forced into had dissolved, leaving behind two people who had been shaped by the same chain of events in different ways. And now, they had a choice. Instead of walking away completely, they chose to build something from what remained. Margaret redirected her resources, everything that had once been tied to loss, anger, and control, into something that served a different purpose. A foundation began to take shape, not as an attempt to erase the past, but to respond to it. It focused on people who had been trapped in situations similar to what both of them had experienced. Victims of fraud, individuals crushed under unjust financial systems, those who had been left carrying burdens they did not create. Elian became part of it. Not as a figurehead, not as a symbol, but as someone who understood exactly what it meant to be trapped without options. He returned to his studies, but this time with clarity. Law was no longer just a degree, it was a tool. A way to ensure that what had happened to him could not be repeated so easily for someone else. The work was not easy. It demanded time, focus, and a level of emotional endurance that went beyond anything he had faced before. But unlike his past struggles, this was not survival. This was purpose. Years passed, and with them, change became visible. Elian completed his education, stepping into a career that aligned with everything he had learned the hard way. He worked cases that reminded him of his own past. People cornered by systems they did not fully understand, contracts designed to exploit, structures built to control rather than protect. And every time, he approached it with the same determination that had once kept him alive. Margaret, meanwhile, stepped back from direct control. Not entirely, but enough to allow something new to grow without being shaped by her past. She focused on guiding, supporting, ensuring that what they had built continued to expand beyond its original form. The foundation grew, reaching more people, becoming something larger than either of them had initially imagined. But time does not move without taking something in return. Margaret's presence, once so commanding, began to quiet in a different way. Age, which she had carried with strength, eventually demanded its due. She did not resist it. She did not cling to what had been. Instead, she faced it with the same composure that had defined her from the beginning. One evening, as the sun set across the wide garden of the estate, she sat in stillness, watching the light fade with a calm that no longer carried tension. There was no urgency left in her. No unfinished plan. No lingering need to correct the past. Only acceptance. Elian remained by her side, not out of obligation, but out of choice. What existed between them at that point could not be easily defined. It was not built on the foundation they had started with. It had been reshaped, rebuilt, redefined through everything they had endured. It was something quieter, stronger, and far more real. When Margaret's life came to its natural end, it was not marked by chaos or regret. It was marked by peace. The foundation she had helped create did not end with her. It continued, growing, adapting, reaching further than she ever could have alone. Her name became tied not to loss or revenge, but to something that outlived both. Elian carried that forward. Not as a burden, but as a responsibility he had chosen. Years later, standing in a courtroom or walking through the offices of the organization they had built, he no longer resembled the exhausted young man who once answered a phone call in a dark apartment. The weight that had once defined him had been transformed into something else entirely. Strength.
Understanding.
Purpose. And though the past never fully disappears, it no longer controlled him. Because in the end, what began as a trap had become something unexpected. Not just an escape, but a path. And Elian Brooks walked it forward, not to outrun what had happened, but to make sure it meant something.